I paid $50 at a nursery for a young fruit tree, and that tree rewarded me with about 20 pounds of apples in its first real harvest. At the time, I figured that meant I was doing everything right. But then, year after year, I watched that same tree struggle. The apples came in smaller and fewer, while the branches kept getting thicker and heavier. Eventually, one winter, a big snowfall hit, and the main scaffold split straight down the middle. That tree never recovered. What nobody ever explained to me was the one skill that separates a fruit tree that feeds your family for 30 years from one that turns into firewood after 5. That skill is winter pruning. And if you don't prune these 7 common fruit trees in January, you'll spend the next 10 years buying fruit at the grocery store while your backyard fills up with giant, impressive-looking trees that barely produce anything at all. This isn't about making your trees look neat or decorative. It's about understanding how a fruit tree actually works. A tree has to decide where its energy goes, and it's always choosing between growing wood and producing fruit. If you don't guide that process, the tree will choose growth every single time, because that's what trees do in the wild. They stretch taller and wider to compete for sunlight, and they only make as much fruit as they need to reproduce. A wild apple tree growing in a forest might produce 50 apples in a year, scattered across 30 feet of branches you can't even reach. But a properly pruned apple tree in a backyard garden can give you 200 apples a season, all on branches you can pick from while standing on the ground. The only real difference between those two trees is that one of them gets pruned every late winter in a way that redirects its energy away from making wood and toward making fruit. That's the real reason you prune fruit trees in January. You're not cutting them back for appearances. You're doing it to triple your harvest the following summer. Winter pruning and summer pruning have opposite effects on a fruit tree. When you understand that, and you apply both at the right time and in the right way, you can turn an average, disappointing tree into a serious fruit producer. There are 3 main reasons to prune trees. First, you remove damaged, diseased, or poorly placed branches. Second, you shape the tree so it's easier to manage and cultivate. And third, you increase the crop and improve the quality of the fruit. That third reason is the one. Most backyard fruit trees are unproductive, and it's not because they're bad trees. It's because they're putting nearly all their energy into growing new wood instead of making fruit. The first tree to understand is the apple. I call it by far the most important hard fruit for temperate climates. And if you only have room for one fruit tree in your yard, it should be an apple tree. Apples store well, they produce heavily, and they respond better to pruning than almost any other fruit tree out there. So here's how you prune an apple tree in January if you actually want results. You begin by cutting out every dead or unhealthy branch, making clean cuts right at the joints where those branches meet the main scaffold. After that, you remove any branches growing inward toward the center of the tree. Those branches will never get enough light to produce good fruit, and all they really do is crowd the middle, trap moisture, and create the perfect conditions for disease to take hold. Once I've cleared out the dead wood and taken out any branches that are growing inward toward the center, the next thing I have to do is shape the scaffold. The scaffold is basically the tree's backbone. It's the main framework made up of the leaders, which are the big branches that shoot straight out from the trunk. The best setup tree number 1 for a backyard apple tree is a Christmas tree shape, or a pyramid scaffold. I love this shape because it is quite practical. The shorter stacked branches in a pyramid are less likely to snap under the weight of fruit, snow, or ice than the long, wide-spreading limbs you get with an open-centered goblet-style tree. To create that pyramid look, I prune each leader back to an outward-facing bud. That part isn't optional, it's critical. I always make my cut about 1/4 of an inch above a bud, and I make sure that bud is pointing in the exact direction I want the new growth to go. If I want a branch to push outward from the middle of the tree, I cut it back to an outward pointing bud. And if I'm trying to keep the tree from getting too wide, I cut it back to a bud that points upward instead. That's the basic trick for controlling the tree's shape year after year, without fighting it. And just as important as the cuts themselves is when I make them. I say this heavier pruning should happen in late winter, but never when the temperature is below 20 degrees Fahrenheit, -7 degrees Celsius, because pruning in colder weather can make the wood brittle and stressed. Tree number 2 is the pear, and pears are pruned almost the same way as apple trees, using that same pyramid-style scaffold and following the same late winter schedule. The big difference is that pear trees tend to grow more aggressively than apples. They pour a lot more energy into growing wood and a lot less into making fruit if you don't keep them under control. Because of that, with pears, I have to be more aggressive with winter pruning during the first few years to really lock in the scaffold shape. Once the tree reaches its mature size, which usually happens after about 4 years, I back off quite a bit and keep winter pruning to a minimum. The more you prune a tree in winter, the faster it grows. But fast growth doesn't mean more fruit. In fact, a tree that's growing too fast usually isn't producing much fruit at all. So once my pear tree is the size and shape I want, I switch to very light winter pruning and depend more on summer pruning to push the tree toward fruit production instead of more wood. Tree number 3 is the plum. Plums are considered stone fruits, which means they have one large pit in the center instead of a core full of seeds like apples and pears. Because of that, stone fruits need a slightly different pruning approach. They're more vulnerable to a disease called silver leaf, which can enter the tree through fresh pruning cuts. So with plums, even though I still prune in late winter like I do with apples and pears, I also have to paint the wounds right away. I use a commercial tree paint or any oil-based paint to seal the cuts and protect them from infection. Plums also have a habit of producing lots of suckers. These are long, straight, fast-growing shoots that pop up from the base of the tree or straight out of the main trunk. Suckers never produce fruit, and if I ignore them, they'll completely take over the tree. So every single winter, I cut them out clean and flush at the joints to keep them under control. Tree number 4 is the cherry. Cherries are also stone fruits, so they need the same kind of wound protection as plums after pruning. But cherries come with an extra challenge. They grow very tall, very fast. If a cherry tree is left to grow naturally, it will push most of its fruit way up high, where I can't reach it without a ladder. Because of that, my winter pruning for cherries is all about keeping the tree short and manageable. Every year, I cut back the main leaders to hold the tree at around 12 to 15 feet tall. I also thin out the side branches so light can reach the center of the tree. That airflow is important because cherries need good circulation to help prevent fungal diseases. Tree number 5 is the peach, and peaches are the most delicate of the 7 trees I'm talking about today. They're especially prone to a disease called peach leaf curl, and they need much more careful pruning than apples or pears. The upside is that all that extra attention pays off. A well-pruned peach tree can reward you with an incredible amount of fruit. The key with peaches is shaping them into an open-centered goblet-style form instead of a pyramid. Peaches need as much sunlight as possible hitting every branch if the fruit is going to ripen properly. To do that, I remove the central leader completely and encourage 3 or 4 main scaffold branches to spread outward. Then, every winter, I prune the lateral branches back to about 6 inches to promote the formation of fruiting spurs. Tree number 6 is the apricot. Apricots are pruned in almost the same way as peaches, using that same open-centered goblet-style shape and the same goal of letting as much sunlight in as possible. The big difference is that apricots are even more sensitive to cold than peaches, so timing really matters here. I have to wait until late winter, after the worst of the cold has passed, but still get the pruning done before the buds begin to swell. With apricots, I also have to stay on top of disease. Any branch that shows signs of trouble needs to come out right away, because apricots are especially vulnerable to bacterial canker. That disease can kill a tree fast if it isn't controlled early. Tree number 7 is the quince. Quinces belong to the Rosaceae family, just like apples and pears, and they're pruned using the same pyramid-style scaffold. The difference is that quinces are much less vigorous than apples or pears, which means they don't need much pruning at all. Most of the time, I'm just removing dead or diseased wood and doing a small amount of shaping to keep that pyramid form intact. Heavy pruning is something I avoid with quinces because they produce fruit on the tips of the previous year's growth. If I cut those branches back too hard, I end up removing all the fruiting wood, and then there's no crop at all. This is why pruning in January is so important. All 7 of these fruit trees, apple, pear, plum, cherry, peach, apricot, and quince, are dormant in late winter. When a tree is dormant, it can handle the stress of pruning without losing energy. But if I wait until spring, when the buds have already started to swell, I'll end up cutting off the fruiting wood and losing my harvest. And if I prune in fall or early winter, when it's too cold, the wounds won't heal properly, which opens the door to disease or even the death of a branch. January is the window. If I miss it, I have to wait another full year. Now this is the part that really changes everything, the part that can easily triple your harvest. It's all about understanding the difference between winter pruning and summer pruning, and using both to control how the tree spends its energy. Winter pruning is done in late winter while the tree is dormant, and its main purpose is shaping the tree and removing unwanted wood. But winter pruning also encourages growth. The more I prune a tree in winter, the faster it will grow the following spring, because when branches are removed, the tree responds by pushing out new shoots to replace what was lost. Summer pruning, on the other hand, happens later in the year, usually during the first week of August, and the goal of summer pruning is completely different from winter pruning. Instead of shaping the tree, summer pruning focuses on shortening the current year's growth. What this does is slow the tree down so it doesn't grow too fast or get too large. More importantly, it redirects the tree's energy away from making wood and toward producing fruit. In late winter, I do my heavy structural pruning. That's when I establish the scaffold shape and remove any dead or diseased wood. Then, when late summer rolls around, I shorten all the branch leaders to about 6 inches, always cutting back to outward-pointing buds. From there, I shorten the lateral branches that come off those leaders to about 3 inches. And finally, any small shoots growing out of those laterals get cut back to roughly 1 inch. This summer, pruning routine is what pushes the tree to start fruiting earlier. If I stick with this process every year and combine it with proper winter pruning, the increase in harvest is dramatic. When the tree reaches maturity, which for standard trees usually takes about 4 years, I should keep winter pruning to an absolute minimum. And by minimum, we mean only a few structural sections each year. Usually that's 2 or 3 cuts to remove dead wood or branches that are crossing or rubbing against each other. A mature tree that's pruned heavily in winter will pour all its energy into growth, not fruit. So the long-term pattern looks like this. Heavy winter pruning during the first 4 years to establish the scaffold, followed by light winter pruning combined with aggressive summer pruning for the rest of the tree's life to maximize fruit production. Here's why this approach works. I like to think of the tree's energy as water flowing through a set of pipes. A fruit tree only has so much energy to work with, and that energy comes from photosynthesis in the leaves. The tree has to divide that energy among 3 competing needs: growth, which means producing new wood; maintenance, which means keeping the existing structure alive; and reproduction, which means making fruit. In nature, a tree will always prioritize growth and maintenance over reproduction. Its goal is to grow as large as possible, compete for sunlight, and live as long as it can. But my goal as a gardener is the opposite. I want the tree to stay small, manageable, and highly productive. Winter pruning removes branches, and that sends a signal to the tree that it needs to replace what was lost. So in spring, the tree responds by pushing out strong, vigorous new shoots. Most of that growth is vegetative. It's just wood, not fruit. Summer pruning works differently. By late summer, the tree has already completed most of its growth for the year. When I shorten those shoots at that point, the tree can't respond by growing more wood because the growing season is almost over. Instead, it redirects that leftover energy into forming fruiting spurs. These are the short, stubby branches that produce flowers, and eventually, fruit. This is how I triple my harvest. I use winter pruning to shape the tree and get rid of unwanted wood, and I rely on summer pruning to push the tree into forming fruiting spurs instead of endless vegetative growth. I'm not just cutting branches at random. I'm working with the tree's biology and steering it toward a very specific result. Timing is everything. If I prune too early in winter, when the temperature drops below 20 degrees Fahrenheit, I risk damaging or even killing the tree. If I wait too long and prune in spring after the buds have started to swell, I end up cutting off the fruiting wood and lose the entire crop. And if I skip summer pruning altogether, the tree dumps all its energy into growth, leaving me with a huge tree and hardly any fruit. The other big factor that helps triple the harvest is the scaffold shape. The traditional open-centered goblet-style shape that a lot of old gardening books recommend really isn't ideal for backyard fruit trees. Those long, spreading branches are more likely to break under the weight of heavy fruit. When a branch breaks, I don't just lose that year's harvest. I also lose the fruiting spurs that would have produced fruit for years after. The shorter branches in a pyramid are stronger and far less likely to snap. On top of that, the pyramid shape lets sunlight reach every part of the tree, which improves fruit quality and helps reduce disease. Here's the practical system I follow. In January or February, when the temperature is above 20 degrees Fahrenheit and the tree is still dormant, I grab my pruning saw and my hand pruners and start with the apple tree. First, I cut out all the dead wood and remove any branches that are growing inward toward the center of the tree, cutting them flush at the joints. Then I step back and study the scaffold. I pick out the 3 or 4 main leaders that make up the structure of the tree, and I prune each one back to an outward-pointing bud to form that pyramid shape. I make sure every cut is about 1/4 of an inch above the bud, and if I'm working on stone fruits like plums, cherries, peaches, or apricots, I paint the wounds to protect them. After that, I move on to the pear and do the exact same thing. Then I repeat the process with the plum, the cherry, the peach, the apricot, and the quince. If I'm working on all 7 trees, the whole job usually takes around 2 hours. I repeat this routine every January for the first 4 years to establish the scaffold. Then, in the 5th year, I switch to very light winter pruning. At that point, I'm mostly just removing dead wood and occasionally shortening a few branches that are starting to get too long. I'm not just pruning for next summer. I'm building something that lasts. I'm shaping a tree that can feed my family for 30 years, one that stays healthy, carries its fruit without breaking, and keeps producing season after season. A well-pruned tree doesn't need constant fixing. It grows in balance, it stays manageable, and it does what it's supposed to do. But a tree that's poorly pruned, or never pruned at all, becomes a problem. It grows too big, produces too little, and eventually breaks under its own weight. In one bad winter storm, you can lose decades of future harvest. The difference between those 2 outcomes is simple. It comes down to what I do in January and what I do in August, year after year. Shape the tree in winter, force fruit in summer. Do that consistently, and a backyard fruit tree stops being just decoration and becomes a reliable food-producing system that can outlive me and keep feeding the people who come after.